Welcome to the first lecture on existentialism, where I cover Jean-Paul Sartre's Existentialism is a Humanism, his 1946 lecture. He gives this lecture 3 years after publishing Being and Nothingness, Le Trautanion, where he espouses his existentialist philosophy. And this lecture is a defense against two accusations, one coming from the communists, who find Sartre's existentialism too abstract, and therefore too bourgeois, and the other charge is coming from the Catholics, who find Sartre's philosophy to be not abstract enough, and therefore devoid of any higher or transcendental values. It forgets the smile of the child, as he says. It makes life devoid of meaning, and it is a philosophy of despair. So what exactly is Sartre's philosophy of existentialism? First and foremost, Sartre saw himself as a phenomenologist when he was writing Being and Nothingness. Being and Nothingness is subtitled A Phenomenological Essay in Ontology. Ontology is the philosophical study of being. Phenomenology is the philosophical study of phenomena. That's very vague. Phenomena is broadly defined, phenomena being things that happen, qualities, data, material of experience. So, how does being arise in phenomena? This is the question that Sartre is posing in his book, Being and Nothingness, this phenomenological essay on ontology. So how does being arise in phenomena? Sartre comes up with a very dualistic ontology. He sees that there are two types of being that are part of phenomena. One is the pour soi, le droit pour soi, or being for itself. The other is the en soi, le droit en soi, being in itself. The in itself, much easier to define. These are just the objects that simply are. The objects of experience, tables, chairs, trees, tools, even my body and the things that I experience and other people. These can be seen as in itself. The pour soi, the le droit pour soi, being for itself, and this is really where it gets tricky, it is what it is not, and it is not what it is. Well, what does that exactly mean? It is what it is not. When Sartre says this, he is talking about the self known strictly by negation. What is the self for Sartre? It is this nothingness. It is not its experience. When I'm in a room of people, I'm not those people. I'm not the room. I'm not even my body as far as Sartre is concerned. I am simply the experience of this. So I am what I am not. And then on the other hand, it is not what it is. This is the self understood through its projects. If I am a teacher and I want to define myself as a teacher, or if I want to become a good student, I define myself as a student. This is not technically what I am for Sartre. It is not what I am. But on the other hand, it's the only thing I can use to define my actions. Sartre actually believes that we are radically free. The for itself, that's us, we are a for itself. He believes in the radical freedom of the for itself. The for itself is always capable, according to Sartre, of redefining its project and thus radically transforming the meaning of the objects and the values of its actions and the consequences of those actions. So by stating my project, by taking on a project, I transform the meaning of the objects, the in itself, and the values of my actions and consequences in light of those freely chosen projects. So, for example, if I'm hiking through the Swiss Alps and I come across this beautiful mountain range, and I'm really just there to enjoy the view, then that mountain out there appears to me as something to be photographed or to be appreciated as a tourist. This is how I see the mountain. But perhaps if my project was being a mountain climber, then those mountains would appear to me completely different. Depending on my project, they would be much more significant. Perhaps I would notice a lot more about them, the contours, what the best approach would be to get on top of the mountain, where the highest peak was, etc., if I'm the mountain climber. If my project involved getting on the other side of the mountain, those mountains might not be as pretty to be pictured, but now there's something to get around or to climb over, or I have to figure out which way I'm going to get around them. Furthermore, if I'm a farmer who lives at the base of the mountain, Well, I might not even notice the mountain. It might be something that it's in the background. It's not that significant to me. Maybe I noticed it when I first built that farm and I thought, oh, geez, this is a really good place for a farm. It gets just the proper sunlight, the proper shade. So all of this is dependent upon the project. How that mountain is significant to me depends on the project that I am pursuing. And now we talk about bad faith. This is Sartre's description of a phenomenon in which we define ourselves as an in itself. When we're in bad faith, we define ourselves as an in itself or as our endpoint, as our goal. We often understand our endpoint or our goal as an in itself. One day it will all be perfect, we tell ourselves. I'll get the home, I'll get the house in the country, the 2 kids, the beautiful wife or the handsome husband, the SUV, the sports car, whatever it is. And then we'll just be a thing. And Sartre says, when we do this, we're lying to ourselves. When we tell ourselves that we are, that we just are, that we have being. It's not that we are these things. We only are these things insofar as we do these things. In reality, for Sartre, we are a for itself that's constantly defining itself and redefining itself and its actions, always in respect of a freely chosen project that can fail, alter, or change at any time. When we deny our radical freedom, when we trick ourselves into believing that we are an in itself, this, for Sartre, is bad faith. And there's obviously more or less extreme cases of bad faith, right? You're really delusional, that's extreme. But for Sartre, and this is probably the key point here that the communists and the Catholics might take issue with, man is a useless passion. This is what Sartre says at the end of Being and Nothingness. Man is a useless passion. And what he means by that is we inevitably want to be, but we never are, the way a desk is a desk. Or as Sartre says, the way an inkwell is an inkwell. We can never be defined clearly like an object. We're constantly in a process of defining ourselves and our actions. And once we do this, we have to keep renewing that definition if we want it to really be sustained. And again, we can never sort of congeal into this in itself. So in a sense, we want to, but it's a useless passion. And for Sartre, that's a good thing. It's a good thing that we aren't things. There are, however, he says, certain limits to our freedom. We aren't absolutely free. One limit, of course, is what he calls facticity, just the brute facts. I don't care what my project is, I won't be able to walk through walls. If I say, I want my project to be Superman who can walk through walls, solid walls, well, let me try that. Doesn't quite work. That's just the facts. And another limit to my freedom, the second limit to my freedom, other freedoms. Other people can oppress me. They can cut me off from other possibilities. But beyond that, beyond my bare facticity and beyond other freedoms, for Sartre, the for itself is radically free. One last point before I move on to the lecture itself. Sartre mentions that in our encounters with other freedoms, we cannot help, in certain moments, but feel what he calls the look of the other. This look of the other is felt in times of shame, usually. That's one example that he focuses on, but it doesn't have to be the only one. In pride, we feel the look of the other perhaps as well. In shame, for instance, we realize that the other is not just an in itself, but another for itself, has come onto the scene. And this is a limit to my freedom. My possibilities are limited. My possibilities are transformed. And in reaction, when we encounter the other, we often try to make an object out of the other. They are someone who doesn't understand me, someone who is ignorant of all the circumstances. They don't get where I'm coming from. We don't see them as a radical freedom, a for itself that is forever out of our reach, something impenetrable. We don't realize that I can never see myself as the other sees me. But at other times, we make ourselves into an in itself. We start to make excuses for our actions when we feel shame before the other, when we feel the look of the other. Oh, I just couldn't help it. That's just the way I am. I've just been misunderstood. You just don't get where I'm coming from. Either way, we objectify the other or we objectify ourselves. And either way, we are denying our radical freedom. Either way, we are, for Sartre, in bad faith. So, back to these two charges against Sartre. The one coming from the communist, that Sartre is too abstract. He's too bourgeois, and that's really a bad objection coming from a communist. You don't want to be a bourgeois philosopher. And why is it too abstract for the communists? Well, you have to understand that Marx himself, Marx's view, is often known as dialectical materialism. Dialectical meaning that there are these two opposing forces that move history, for Marx, the class struggle. Materialism in the sense that everything can be explained in terms of material conditions, social economic conditions. And so for him, Sartre's philosophy, which includes this radical freedom where my projects give meaning to the material, this for a Marxist would be way too abstract. Now, the second charge from the Catholics is the opposite. Sartre is not abstract enough. If you're a theologian, you need abstract concepts like God or the Trinity or things like this. If there are no abstract ideas a priori, then there are no higher transcendental values. If it's just all meaningless at the bottom and what gives meaning to it is our radical freedom, for the Catholic or the theologian in general perhaps, this leads to a quiet despair. This is the charge against existentialism. It leads to a life without meaning or value. No one is held accountable. No one can be condemned or even praised, right? Man is a useless passion. And Sartre wants to show that this is not necessarily true. He aims to defend himself against the charges. He tries to show that existentialism is a humanism. And in this lecture, I think Sartre unfortunately dumbs down his philosophy, and subsequently he makes this a fairly weak philosophical defense of his doctrine. And Sartre himself regretted giving this lecture almost immediately afterwards and continued to shun it for the rest of his days. Ironically, it is the most widely anthologized of any of his works. So hopefully when we get to Simone de Beauvoir, the next reading, the next two lectures will be over her, we'll have a much better picture and a much better defense of existentialism. So Sartre's first contention, his first part of the defense, he says existentialism is a doctrine which makes human life even possible. Existentialism declares that every truth and every action implies a human setting and a human subjectivity. Perhaps this is what makes it a humanism. Existentialism is charged with emphasizing just the dark side of human life. It's considered base and ugly. Well, exactly what is this existentialism? We've talked a little bit about his philosophy from being and nothingness, but how does he define existentialism here? He distinguishes between Christian and atheist existentialists, people like Jaspers and Marcel. He doesn't mention Paul Tillich, but that would be another example of a Christian existentialist. And alongside him, with the atheist existentialist, he groups Heidegger, Camus, Merleau-Ponty, and of course Simone de Beauvoir, who doesn't get mentioned, but we will be covering her later. Now, I must note here that Heidegger would probably not be too happy, and he wasn't happy when he read this, the transcript of this. Heidegger did not consider himself an existentialist, although he's often given that title. But what do these people all have in common? And what is existentialism according to Sartre? They all believe that existence precedes essence. And this is perhaps the most pithy definition one could give for existentialism, but it does need some explanation. What does he mean here by existence preceding essence? Well, he first starts out here on page 226 with an example of a man-made object, part of the in itself, something that's just a piece of material out there in the world, an object for the for itself. And he shows how this man-made object is not that way. Its existence does not precede its essence. It's rather the reverse. Its essence comes first. So let's read along here on page 226. Let us consider some object that is manufactured. For example, a book or a paper cutter. Here is an object which has been made by an artisan whose inspiration came from a concept. He referred to the concept of what a paper cutter is, and likewise to a known method of production, which is part of the concept, something which is, by and large, a routine. Thus, the paper cutter is at once an object produced in a certain way, and on the other hand, one having a specific use. And one cannot postulate a man who produces a paper cutter but does not know what it is used for. Therefore, let us say that for the paper cutter, essence, and here he gives us his definition for essence, what does he mean by essence? Therefore, let us say that for the paper cutter, essence, that is the ensemble both of the production routines and the properties which enable it to be both produced and defined, precedes existence. Thus, the presence of the paper cutter or book in front of me is determined. Therefore, we have a technical view of the world whereby it can be said that production precedes existence. So if we think about maybe a pen or a pencil, before this thing is ever created, before the pen ever even makes it to your hand or your pocket, there was a plan in place. Right? There were people who got together and decided that they were going to manufacture pens, and they were going to figure out how to do it and where to distribute these pens, and what the proper ink would be and the proper method for producing it, and they knew what they would be used for. Well, it's not so simple with us. We can't be defined like a pen. How do I define a pen? It's a writing utensil. I use it to write with. It has ink in it. And I could probably get more technical if I wanted to, but I could define it pretty easily and pretty simply, and it would be very unambiguous. For Sartre, we are not like this. We do not have an essence, a prefabricated essence, before we exist. There's not a plan in place. For Sartre, there would have to be some divine creator, and since he's an atheistic existentialist, this is really not an option for him. So he's saying here that we exist first and then define ourselves in terms of some sort of project. And so if we read on 227, we'll get Sartre's explanation here of what he means by this, and this is probably the most often quoted passage of all Sartre's work. What is meant here by saying that existence precedes essence? It means that first of all, man exists, turns up, appears on the scene, and only afterwards defines himself. If man, as the existentialist conceives him, is indefinable, it is because at first he is nothing. Only afterward will he be something, and he himself will have made what he will be. Thus there is no human nature, since there is no God to conceive it. Not only is man what he conceives himself to be, but he is also only what he wills himself to be after this thrust towards existence. So man is what he makes of himself. Not only does existentialism give to man a special dignity, according to Sartre, he is the only being whose existence precedes essence, so it does give man a special dignity, but it also holds him absolutely accountable. It makes the full responsibility of his existence rest on him. When he says that he is not only responsible for his own individuality, he's also saying he's responsible for all men. How does this work? It's not clearly apparent. I think he does a really bad job of explaining this in this lecture. How is it that I'm responsible for all men? Maybe the look of the other holds me and I have to think about what I'm doing and take stock of my actions when I feel the look of the other. But why is it that when the individual chooses, they choose for all men? Well, hopefully by the end of the lecture, we'll have some glimmer of an idea of why he says this. Why am I accountable to all other freedoms? So he says also, nothing can be good for us without being good for all. And I find that suspect. Maybe this is poorly worded. But when we get to his example of Abraham and the woman who gets phone calls from God, I think maybe if he means it in that sense, perhaps it's a bit of a stronger case that he has for this claim that my good can't just be my good. It has to be a good before everybody else. When I say I value something, I have to keep upholding that value before the other, before the look of the other. And in that sense, it's not just my value. It's my value before the other. And so Sartre is right about this. If our ideal is the ideal for all, and if existence precedes essence, then our responsibility is even greater than we might have supposed, because it involves all mankind. If I choose a life of piety, if I choose a monogamous married life, then I'm involving all humanity in my act. I'm creating an image of man in my choosing. In choosing myself, I choose mankind. Really, I think he's using a bit strong. The language here is a bit strong. And I think he should have been a bit more subtle or maybe explained a little bit more what he means. Perhaps we won't really get a strong case for this claim until we get to the reading for Simone de Beauvoir. But this responsibility that we have, this overwhelming responsibility, Sartre thinks is what explains or helps us understand the actual content of words like anguish, forlornness, and despair, these three key terms that we'll turn to now: anguish, forlornness, and despair. What does he mean by anguish? Well, for Sartre, anguish is the realization that not only am I what I choose to be, but I'm also this lawmaker, in a sense, who chooses all mankind as well as myself. So anguish is this feeling of total and deep responsibility, not just to myself, but to all others. That's the anguish. And many of us try to hide this anxiety. We try to pretend that we do not hold this deep responsibility. And the fact that we lie to ourselves, this reveals a guilty conscience. He goes over the example of Abraham and the woman who gets phone calls from God. Imagine a lady every day at 5 o'clock, she gets phone calls and she hears the voice of God. And Abraham himself, who apparently heard a voice from God telling him to sacrifice his son. Well, he decided that that was really God. But did he have to? Maybe that was the devil tricking him. Does this lady have to believe that God's calling her on the phone? No, she doesn't. She could completely think it's a prank call or something like this. But once Abraham decides, no, that's God who told me to sacrifice Isaac. Once the lady says, no, this is really God calling me on the phone. It's not just their truth, okay? It's not just, it's just my truth and for you it's false and you're right and I'm right, but none of us are right because there's no objectivity. No, that's not it. Once he decides that that's God who told him to sacrifice Isaac, once she decides that that's God who's calling her on the phone, Abraham might understand why you don't believe them, but they still think that's the truth. Look, I know you don't believe me that God's calling me, but I swear it's him. I know it's God. So every moment for Sartre, he says that I am obliged, as a subjectivity, I'm obliged to perform what he calls exemplary acts. Everything happens as if all mankind had its eyes transfixed on me. If I'm not hiding this anguish, that my value or my project, my choice affects all mankind. And this anguish is not an anguish that leads to quietism, to inaction. That's what the communist would say. Well, if you've got too much responsibility, this burden is overwhelming. Better to think of more of a collective actions of a collectivity rather than the individual's responsibility. This is too overwhelming. It leads to inaction. You don't want to do anything. You want to live a life of quietism. And Sartre says, well, no, anyone who has responsibilities is privy to this anguish. And he gives the example, I think that the good example he gives is the one of the military officer. You know, this military officer who alone has to make the choice of whether or not to send the troops. And he knows that the lives of these men depend on his choice, his interpretation of the orders from above. And in making this decision, he can't help but feel the anguish, says Sartre. This anguish doesn't prevent him from acting. Rather, it is the condition for his action. He understands the responsibility. It gives all of those choices real weight. He has to envision the number of possibilities, to choose one, and to realize the choice has value only because it is chosen. This is a key point for Sartre. Actions speak louder than words. I can talk about what the best choice is, but what I really do, that's what I think the best choice is. This is what Sartre says. And this anguish that we feel, he thinks can only be explained by this direct responsibility that I have to other men. Now, forlornness, this is a concept he gets from Heidegger. Now, Sartre gives a very atheistic spin to this idea, but I don't think it necessarily has to be atheistic. He says that it's the realization that God does not exist and that we have to face the consequences of this. Unlike a secular ethics like Kantian ethics or Mill's ethics, which think even if God doesn't exist, we can still just use rationality and reason to get these a priori ethical values. Sartre says no, the existentialist finds it very distressing that God does not exist. Again, I think he's giving a very atheistic spin on this. It doesn't necessarily have to be so. It's just the idea that even if God does exist, we certainly don't know for sure. We don't have his phone number, right? We can't call him on the telephone every day. Even if you heard a voice, it could be a demon. Who knows? So this is the forlornness. We're alone. We're on our own. We have to decide. Abraham has to decide. What evidence does Abraham have to prove that that's God talking to him and not just himself going crazy? What would you think if your neighbor came over and said, hey, God told me to sacrifice my son, so could you babysit my other kids while I go sacrifice my son? You'd think he's crazy, wouldn't you? So again, it's up to that person to decide whether it's the voice of God, whether he's going nuts. And that's forlornness, being on one's own and not having these values to turn to, not having this sure a priori ethical system to turn to that you'll always be able to justify yourself with. Right? I can't always turn to Kant. I can't always turn to religion because I always have to decide for myself what certain things mean. So neither within myself nor without myself do I find anything to cling to. I'm forlorn, says Sartre. And subsequently, I can't start making excuses for myself, right? If existence precedes essence, then there is no fixed human nature. Man is free. Man is freedom. Without God, without these higher values, we have nothing to turn to in order to legitimize our conduct. We have no excuses, and we have no justification. Man is condemned to be free, a very paradoxical sounding idea that we're condemned to be free. What is this, the chains of freedom? Well, let's read here on 229 and see what Sartre means by this, that man is condemned to be free. That is the idea I shall try to convey when I say that man is condemned to be free. Condemned because he did not create himself, yet in other respects he's free. Because once thrown into the world, he is responsible for everything he does. The existentialist does not believe in the power of passion. He will never agree that a sweeping passion is a ravaging torrent which fatally leads a man to certain acts and is therefore an excuse. He thinks that man is responsible for his passion. So man is condemned every moment to, as Sartre puts it, to invest man and to interpret every omen as he sees fit, interpret every sign to suit himself. Man is the future of man, another phrase that Sartre gives us, not some predetermined future, but a wide open future of possibilities. Man is forlorn. And we can't opt out of choosing. Even to not choose itself is a choice, right? To give my choice to somebody else is itself a choice. He mentions the case of the student who comes to ask for advice. And this is probably one of the most famous examples he gives of the student who asks him after class, "What should I do, Sartre? Should I stay with my mother who's a widow, and all my brothers have died in the struggle and in the war and the resistance? Or should I go join the resistance, fight for my country, and avenge my father and my brother's death? What do I do, Sartre? I want to go fight for honor, but I can't leave my mom by herself. What if I die? She'll be all alone." What does Sartre tell the student? Well, he says, it's up to you, buddy. You're forlorn. The Christian, the Kantian, other ethical systems, they can't help you either. Really? How can he say this? Well, let's read here on page 230. Who could help him choose? Christian doctrine? No, Christian doctrine says be charitable, love your neighbor, take the more rugged path, etc., etc. But which is the more rugged path? Whom should he love as a brother? The fighting man or his mother? Which does the greater good? The vague act of fighting in a group, or the concrete one of helping a particular human being to go on living? Who can decide a priori? Nobody. No book of ethics can tell him. The Kantian ethic says, never treat any person as a means, but always as an end. Very well, if I stay with my mother, I'll treat her as an end and not as a means, but by virtue of this fact, I'm running the risk of treating the people around me who are fighting as a means. And conversely, if I go to join those who are fighting, I'll be treating them as an end, and by doing that, I run the risk of treating my mother as a means. So, for Sartre, it's up to the student. He has to decide. He's forlorn. In the end, of course, the young man decides to trust his feelings, to go with his feelings, with his gut. But how is the value of these feelings determined? What gives his feeling for his mother value here on page 230? Precisely the fact that he remained with her, Sartre writes. I may say that I like so-and-so well enough to sacrifice a certain amount of money for him, but I may say so only if I've done it. I may say that I love my mother well enough to remain with her if I have remained with her. The only way to determine the value of this affection is precisely to perform an act which confirms and defines it. So my choice, my decision, my act confirms and defines what I value. And Sartre makes this interesting point about when we go to seek advice. He seems to be implying that we usually already have decided what we want to do. And we're maybe just seeking some outside confirmation. We're always very mindful of who we seek advice from, right? We kind of understand what we want to do, and we're looking for the person who's going to agree with us. And no general thesis of ethics can really show us what must be done in all cases. And Sartre gives the example of the Jesuit, right? Who he could have become a carpenter, a revolutionary, this guy who keeps failing in all his endeavors. He doesn't get into medical school, doesn't get into law school. Oh, I should become a priest. God is telling me that I should be a priest. Well, sure, says Sartre, but you could have decided to be something else. It was up to you to interpret what those omens meant, right? You interpreted those omens alone. You alone decided what those signs meant. This is what Sartre is going to insist. Okay, finally we come to despair. We've gone over anguish, forlornness, now despair. What does Sartre mean by despair? Well, he gives us a very confusing definition here on page 231 when he says, it means that we shall confine ourselves to reckoning with only that what depends upon our will, or on the ensemble of probabilities which make our actions possible. Not very illuminating there, very confusing, lots to unpack. I think, though, if we turn to his example of waiting for the arrival of a friend at a train station, this is a little bit more clear. You know, he's waiting at the train station for Pierre. Why is despair involved? Well, what could possibly go wrong? Is it an a priori necessary truth that Pierre will arrive on time? No, anything could happen. Pierre maybe missed the train. Pierre wants to stand up Sartre. Maybe he's angry with Sartre. Pierre got a heart attack. Who knows? All these things could happen. The point is that whenever we involve ourselves in group efforts, whenever we join political movements, for instance, we are always in this similar situation as we are when we're waiting on a friend. We trust that all is going to work out. Everything's going to go through. But there's always the possibility for failure. So does that mean I should resign myself to quietism, to inaction? I mean, anything could go wrong. I mean, I'm never guaranteed to succeed. Why should I start to begin with? Is that a good argument? Well, no. First off, nothing ventured, nothing gained. If you don't do anything, you're definitely going to fail. At least you have a chance of success if you try. And also because for Sartre, existentialism is the opposite of quietism. It's the opposite of a philosophy of inaction. There is no reality for Sartre except in my actions. Man is nothing else except for his plan. He exists only to the extent that he fulfills himself. He is nothing but an ensemble of his acts, nothing else than his life. And this pronouncement, says Sartre, this is what makes existentialism so hard to swallow for some people. They like to make excuses for their lack of accomplishments. But for Sartre, man is involved in life, leaves his impress on it, and outside of that, there is nothing. Man is nothing else than a series of his undertakings. So at the bottom, Sartre thinks that existentialism is being criticized not for its pessimism, but for its optimistic toughness. And he says that a constitution is not an act. That is not a legal constitution, a political constitution, but a constitution as in my constitution, what I'm constituted of, what I'm born with. So my constitution is not an act. I'm not born a hero or born a coward, and then I can just leave it to rest, right? Oh, my parents had the hero DNA, so I have hero DNA, so I'm just going to sit here and be a hero. No, that doesn't work, right? For the existentialist, we have to act a coward or act like a hero. Only in action are we heroes or are we cowards. So existentialism is not a doctrine of quietism, the communist charge. it defines man solely in terms of action. And it's not a pessimistic doctrine. That's the Catholic charge. It's very optimistic because it gives man control of his destiny. Man's destiny is within himself. So existentialism is an ethics of action and involvement, claims Sartre. But we still have these charges of subjectivism, possibly even solipsism, and this extreme individualism where anything goes. Well, Sartre mentions there's two sort of understandings of subjectivism, and he admits that subjectivity is the point of departure for existentialism, and that existentialists will acknowledge that no one can transcend their own subjectivity. We are stuck in our individual subjectivity. I can't jump out of my own subjective standpoint and inhabit yours, for instance, okay? So in that sense, he admits it's a subjectivism, but it's not subjective in the sense that man creates values in a vacuum. He thinks that by examining existentialism, we understand that my subjectivity always includes the subjectivity of others. He has this notion he calls intersubjectivity. The subjectivity that we've arrived at in the existentialist doctrine is not strictly an individual subjectivity. It always involves the subjectivity of others. In order to get at truths about myself, I need contact with others. So let's read here on page 234 where he explains this. Thus, the man who becomes aware of himself through the cogito, that's, I think, the Descartes' ego, once he becomes aware of himself through the cogito, he also perceives all others, and he perceives them as the condition of his own existence. He realizes that he cannot be anything, in the sense that we say someone is witty or nasty or jealous, unless others recognize it as such. In order to get at any truth about myself, I must have contact with another person. The other is indispensable to my own existence, as well as to my knowledge about myself. This being so, in discovering my inner being, I discover the other person at the same time, like a freedom placed in front of me, which thinks and wills only for or against me. Hence, let us at once announce the discovery of a world which we shall call intersubjectivity. This is the world in which man decides what he is and what others are. Now, of course, Sartre has to talk about intersubjectivity because objectivity is off the table. Objectivity assumes that there's this world of prefabricated values, ready-made values waiting for you, and that our existence does not precede our essence. So for him, it's all intersubjective. If I look at myself and I want to talk about myself in terms like witty or smart or intelligent, I can't do this by myself. I have to be recognized by others as such. I mean, sure, I can call myself a genius all I want. I'm going to be a genius. Look what a genius I am. Is that going to work, though? Maybe if I pay everybody off to tell me that I'm a genius. But even then, that's not truly being a genius. That's being a very vindictive, that's just being a very corrupt individual. But this doesn't completely settle the charges of subjectivism, right? Isn't anything permitted? I mean, you can just do anything no matter what. Isn't this kind of what Sartre is saying? And Sartre says, he somewhat acknowledges this. He says, well, sure, choice is always possible, but what is not possible is not to choose. Not to choose is a choice itself. You know, if I in any way assume responsibility for a choice, which also involves all mankind, then this has nothing to do with arbitrariness, with capriciousness. It's not just caprice. And he gives us a very good analogy, I think, here on 236. He says a work of art is never arbitrary, and neither are our moral acts, even if there are no a priori values to determine my choice. So even if there are no a priori artistic values for creating an artistic masterpiece, that doesn't make a work of art an arbitrary creation. When Picasso went into his studio to paint Guernica, he was upset because of the bombings in Spain. So there was some event that had just happened. He was really upset about it. He went into his studio. He had a certain canvas. He had certain material. And one brushstroke leads to another, right? Oh, that looks good. I need to fill in the gaps here and do this, and it'll look better. And then voila, a masterpiece is created. Now, this isn't completely arbitrary, of course, but you wouldn't say that it was based on some a priori principles. An interviewer talking to Picasso afterwards wouldn't ask him, hey, So you just painted a masterpiece. How can anybody follow a rule and just always paint a masterpiece? What's the a priori rule for creating masterpieces? Picasso would perhaps laugh, or he would just be confused. What are you talking about? But that doesn't mean that the work of art was just completely haphazard and just completely arbitrary. And so Sartre thinks that this charge of arbitrariness is absurd, right? Man is defined in relationship to involvement in a world of other freedoms, other subjectivities. But still, where does condemnation come in? How can we say that's a bad work of art, right? We can never really judge anyone for their activities. What if I say I want to be a serial killer and I use my radical freedom to do this? Is that any different from being a head of state? It seems like Sartre he lacks a response to this, but he says, well, in one sense, I can't condemn a person if their choice is made in full acknowledgement of their freedom, if they really acknowledge that their existence precedes their essence, that they're beholden to anguish, forlornness, and despair. If the choice is made with full acknowledgement of all this, then it really can't be condemned. But if the choice is made in ignorance or in denial of my freedom, then it can be condemned. And really, the existentialists do declare one positive moral value, and that's freedom. He says if we admit our forlornness, if we admit our absolute freedom, that we're condemned to be free, then we can no longer want but one thing: freedom as the basis for all values. And not just freedom in the abstract, but a concrete freedom. And the meanings of my acts, if I'm honest about my freedoms, should become a quest for the freedom of all men. This abstract desire for freedom is always wanted, he says, in something concrete. A freedom for freedom's sake in every particular circumstance. In wanting freedom, we see that it depends entirely on the freedom of others, and that the freedom of others depends on ours. Now, here's where he starts making these really bold claims that seem somewhat groundless. We're going to have to wait until we get to the lectures on Simone de Beauvoir until we get a really good explanation for this. Why should I, if I want to be as free as possible, why should I care about the other's freedom? What if I want to be a dictator and take all their freedom away? And take all the freedom for myself? Sartre doesn't really give us a good explanation for why in this lecture. And so he says freedom as the definition of man does not depend on others, this abstract freedom, but as soon as there's involvement, as soon as I'm in a world of others, then I'm obliged to want freedom for the others. And so once I realize my full responsibility, this responsibility I have for all my actions, once I realize my freedom, then I'm obliged to promote freedom in others. And really, I think this is what's hard to see in this article. Why is my freedom tied to others? And why is their freedom tied to mine? Sartre thinks that if I acknowledge all this, then I can pass judgment upon and seek out those who would try to hide and try to deny and disguise man's freedom. I can call them cowards. I can call them enemies of freedom. And so for Sartre, this is the one value he can claim is freedom, and this is the basis for his condemnation of others. Again, doesn't give a very strong argument for it here. For that, we're going to have to wait for Simone de Beauvoir. But why is he calling existentialism a humanism here? The title of his lecture, Existentialism is a Humanism. Hasn't really explained this and doesn't do it until the end. He admits that it's not humanistic in the classical sense of the word. The humanistic movement starting in maybe the Renaissance period, early Renaissance, Italian Renaissance period. This is the humanism that takes mankind, humanity, as an end, as a higher value. And it describes a value to man based on the highest deeds of certain men, certain artists or scientists. Sartre finds that absurd. He doesn't think he's a humanist in that regard. But he does believe that there is no universe other than the human universe. All significance, all values come from man. So in that sense, existentialism is a humanism. It understands that man is constantly outside of himself, projecting himself, losing himself. And it is through pursuing transcendent goals that he's able to exist in the sense that he does, where he exists and then he carves out an essence for himself. It's humanism because for Sartre, there is no lawmaker other than man himself.